Welcome to Sputnik, still orbiting the world in the time of the coronavirus, perhaps especially so. I'm George Galloway. It's stripped down, it's wartime conditions. Gayatri is confined at home, but I'm still here on the front line, bringing you the best analysis of what's going on in the world that I possibly can. Now, the whole world knows, does it not, that this coronavirus 19 originated in China, in Wuhan, in a wet market, in a bat that someone ate. Or is that the whole story? Is that actually even true? Well, I'm joined by an American abroad, writer and broadcaster, Tom McGregor, who works, lives and is married even in China, in Beijing, and he joins me now. Tom, thank you for coming on board the Sputnik. Let's start with that. Tell us what your take is on how this virus emerged, because you must be aware, as someone living in China, that China is carrying the can for this in at least the minds of the powerful in Western countries.
Well, of course, there's lots of speculation, but despite all of the speculation, the scientists are still trying to discover the true origin. As you know, there was speculation about a wet market in Wuhan. The wet market did exist, but there's also some scientific evidence to show that the people who were eating the food that they should not be eating, they may not have been the first coronavirus patient. So they're still trying to search for that first coronavirus patient. And then once they find that patient zero, then they're going to be able to figure out how it started. The only thing we really know is that Wuhan was the epicenter. It looks like it was the beginning of where it started. And the facts is that it's from China. Okay, we do have to accept that. The Beijing has to accept it. But did it come from a wet market? Did it come from something odd or strange? I'm not exactly sure. You got to realize is that viruses are just, they're virus, okay? So you've had plagues throughout centuries. You've had, in history, you've had epidemics, and it was inevitable that there was going to be a super virus that was spreading. I was reading reports a few years ago, about these type of viruses that any type of antibacterial medicines won't stop them. So it was inevitable that something like this would happen, and it just so happened to start here in China.
Now, China has responded, let's say robustly, you could say more than that, and it has put whole regions of millions and millions of people into lockdown. It sustained a phenomenal hit on its economy.
Yeah.
They were out fumigating the streets. Everyone's going around in masks. They seem to have gotten on top of it. Or are they? Because there's now Western news reports that actually the Chinese death toll is many times greater than China has conceded, and indeed that it may not be under control even in China yet.
Well, I'm glad you asked that because, you know, the fact is I live in the capital city of Beijing. I've been here since late December, every single day in Beijing since late December. I had witnessed it from the beginning, and it is getting much better. My wife is Chinese. She's always staying updated on coronavirus news on her Chinese language apps. They have real-time alerts. They got any news you want to find out about coronavirus in China, she has access to it. And I remember early February, it was a disaster, very scary time. That's not happening right now. And in regards to about hiding it, Well, then why do I see so many more people walking outside, going places, going to work, going to their jobs, going shopping? It's a whole big difference. It's almost returned to normal.
Now, tell me this. The government in China must be smarting at the ceaseless attacks from other countries. I personally have no problem with what Donald Trump calls a Chinese flu or a Chinese virus or a Wuhan virus. After all, the Spanish flu had nothing to do with Spain. It came from Texas. You can be right or you can be wrong with the attribution of where a virus, an illness comes from. But nonetheless, there is clearly a big propaganda job being done on China now by people who wish it ill. Is the Chinese government going to reevaluate its relationship to the world in the light of this propaganda, do you think?
Well, let me tell you what the real problem is with this anti-China campaign. And I'm talking to people in Beijing that, let's just say, they're very important. And the fact is, they understand that people are anti-China. They've gotten used to it. But what really is frustrating them is they want to help the world. They have lots of medical supplies that they want to export to other countries. They want to send out their medical teams out to other countries. They want to be able to help the United Kingdom. They want to help the European Union. They want to help the United States. But when all of a sudden you have all of these crazy anti-China stories, oh, China is exporting fake face masks, they're exporting fake stuff, when it turns out that the stuff they were sending was not being properly used, or they were buying from companies that not even the Chinese government recommended. That's the kind of fake news that's happening, and it's delaying China's ability to help out.
Now, Tom, I don't want to make you nervous with your Chinese wife and all, but reportedly there's a gigantic spike in divorces in China. Has that anything to do with the coronavirus?
Yeah, I got that messages from your lovely wife, and I heard about the story, and as I explained earlier, is the fact is you have a backlog of cases. For about 2-3 months, you had the marriage office and the divorce office, they were shut down for 2-3 months, okay? So if there was gonna be divorces, they couldn't do it during the quarantines because those offices were closed. So now the offices are open. All the people who were going to have a divorce, whether or not there was a virus or not, now they're rushing there. It's inevitable. It's nothing massive. It's just a simple case of backlog cases.
Okay, let me return to Wuhan, to the wet market, which you acknowledge does exist.
I want to say did exist. Did, past tense.
Is it closed now?
It's closed.
Well, that's good news, actually, and partly obviates the question I was going to ask, but not entirely. There is a feeling that the Chinese predilection for eating wildlife is a health accident waiting to happen, and not just for the person eating the wildlife. It's said that eating wildlife in China has caused more than one virus. The Chinese government is extremely organized, extremely conscious of its reputation in the world. Is it likely to change the eating habits of some Chinese people? And will the government make them change?
Well, I'll let you know that in the big cities, those wet markets will not exist. You got to remember, in the big cities, you have a lot of police officers. I go to Beijing. I live here in Beijing. Anytime I walk outside, I see a uniformed police officer. Everywhere I go, I'm going to see someone who is a law enforcement official or a public security guard. Everywhere I'm walking. So in these big cities, if there is any of these wet markets open, they'll shut them down. If they're open, it's probably in some rural villages that are isolated. It's hard to find. Somehow they still pop up. But obviously, if the Chinese government sees media reports, I really don't think that they're going to allow those markets to stay open once they know the locations and that they're still running, because China definitely knows this has really embarrassed the country.
Now, Tom, you're an American. You must know that back in your home country, the Democrats hate Russia and the Republicans hate China. It's a George Orwell hate fest between both parties, but with different targets. President Trump and his circle have what appears to be a down on China, to say the least. How does that make you feel?
Well, I see right now that look what's happening with the coronavirus right now. The U.S. has been, especially, and I'm not blaming Trump at all. I think basically Trump is not getting the best information. China has tried to warn the White House, but the problem is they have to go through diplomatic channels. That's just the way it's done. So they have to go through the Secretary, the State Department, in order to communicate to the White House. And guess who's in charge of the State Department? Pompeo. I like to call him Pompous Pompeo because he is absolutely the worst U.S. Secretary of State in American history. He has done a disastrous job, and he has focused so much attention on his anti-China, I hate China stuff, that he has done absolutely nothing to try to respond to the coronavirus. He is creating delays. If anyone is a hero right now from the White House, I say it's Vice President Pence.
Why so?
Well, because he's actually trying to do something about the response. He's not getting involved in all the politics. He's not going around saying, I hate China, or let's talk about the Chinese virus. If you listen carefully to Pence, he does not use the word Wuhan virus. He does not say Chinese virus.
Now, Tom McGregor, I was going to say stay safe, but the way things are going, it's probably you that needs to say that to me. Be healthy, you and all your family. And thanks for joining us on board the Sputnik.
Thank you.
Coming up after the break, one of the unsung giants of modern British politics and a champion of Brexit before the word was even invented. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Sputnik. Now, I used to say when Harold Wilson was the Prime Minister that if he'd been run over by the Clapham omnibus in the morning, at least 10 members of his cabinet could easily have taken over as Prime Minister in the afternoon. Indeed, many of them spent most of their days trying to become so. One of the giants of British politics is now largely forgotten from that period, but could easily, maybe should have been the Prime Minister of Britain. That man is Peter Shaw, the subject of a wonderful new biography by Dr. Kevin Hickson of Liverpool University, whom I'm glad to say joins me now. Doctor, thanks very much for coming down in these difficult times, for getting on a ghost train and coming to London. Peter Shaw's become a bit of a ghost in British politics. Not for me, because I sat next to him in Parliament for many years and fully grasped how significant a figure he was. If he's up there in heaven now, he'll be happy enough that we voted to Brexit. But what do you think he'd think of British politics today?
I think he'd be rather pessimistic, really. I agree very much with the comment that you made on the opening there. The quality of politicians in the 60s and the 70s, even the Thatcher government in the 80s, that we disagree with ideologically, but there were big beasts in those cabinet, and there isn't anymore. And that's a sad state of British politics at the moment, I think. I mean, if you compare the leadership contests that Shaw stood in 1883, or even the 1976 one when he backed Michael Foot, there were 6 members of the cabinet there, big beasts of the cabinet, who stood for the leadership. And the quality of the debate, the quality of the candidates, and the current Labour leadership isn't up there, I'm afraid.
Well, quality is the important word there, I think. If you look at Peter Shaw's summing up speech in the Oxford Union, in a debate between the likes of Edward Heath and the likes of Michael Foot and Barbara Castle, and summed up by Peter Shore. 6 minutes, I think it is. It's on YouTube. It is 6 minutes of absolute brilliance, dazzling brilliance.
Yep.
One can't quite imagine today's politicians rising to that level of quality.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think a lot of it is about the selection processes. Currently in the Labour Party, to some extent the Conservatives as well, but particularly in the Labour Party, I think, where you've got people who've been special advisors, they're then drafted into safe seats and they quickly get moved up to the front bench. They've got no outside experience, whereas I think people of Shore's generation did have a lot of outside experiences. Growing up in poverty, initially in East Anglia and then he moved to Liverpool, working in the Labour Research Department, and his constituency activities in a difficult part of London, all added to Peter's character, I think.
Well, I ultimately represented his constituency from East London. I used to have fascinating conversations at the Welsh table. I have no idea how I ended up there, or he for that matter, in the tea room. Mr. Foot would talk about the 30s and talk about the war, and Mr. Shore would seldom allow any conversation to forget the fact that we were in the European Union, and that was one of the significant reasons. We've now Brexited. Have we, or will we Brexit on the terms, on the basis that Peter Shore would have liked? What do you think would have been the differences between a Peter Shore Brexit and a Boris Johnson Brexit?
Well, I think both would, Boris says, and Peter Shore certainly would have wanted to reclaim as much sovereignty as possible. I would have thought that was an essential first step, but then would very much disagree about what you then do with that sovereignty. So Boris presumably wants to further free market economics in Britain, whereas Peter Shore had a very different economic and social model in mind, which he thought was impeded by being a member of the European Economic Communities.
And what was that social and economic model?
Well, he was very much a socialist, a democratic socialist. He believed that the state had a beneficial role to play in managing the economy and creating full employment. As Shadow Chancellor in the early 80s, very critical, rightly really, in our view, of the monetarist economic agenda that Margaret Thatcher was pursuing with all the human misery that created, and a much more egalitarian model as well. And sadly, those things were lost in the Labour Party at the end of Peter's life. I mean, he became a critic of New Labour, because he believed that they were far too willing to compromise with the social and economic reality which the Thatcher and major governments had created.
I have a confession to make. I was one of those responsible, in a small-ish way, though I was the chairman of the Scottish Labour Party at the time, for pushing Michael Foot to stand for the leader in 1980, which he did and won. But which disappointed Peter Shore terribly. I'm now going to confess to you that I think that was a mistake, that if Peter Shore had run instead of Michael Foot, Peter Shore would have been a more successful leader. I don't say a better man, they were both great men, but would have been a more successful leader than Michael Foot ultimately was. Is that your analysis?
Yeah, and that's very much what we go into in the book. So Michael Foot went to see Peter just after Jim Callaghan announced that he was going to stand down, and said, I'm going away for the weekend to do a lecture about Jonathan Swift. When I come back on the Monday, I'll support you. And then people persuaded him.
Over that weekend, I remember very well, we were meeting in the Central Hotel in Glasgow, and we got a round robin up, and it helped push Michael into standing. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and then when Michael came back after that weekend, he said to Peter that he'd been persuaded to stand himself, and I think that was regrettable, as you just said, really, because I think Michael Foot had lots of qualities. He was an amazing man, really. But sadly, he wasn't an appropriate person
Perhaps
to be leader of the Labour Party in the television age. And I think Peter would have coped much better with those pressures. Really.
So what might have been the differences if Michael had not stood, Peter had stood and won?
I think Peter would have been more of a party unifier. The SDP split may not have occurred. Peter would have been fully supportive of the Falklands War at the time. while maybe being critical of some of the things that went on during the Falklands War. But he was a committed patriot, and I think he would have been supportive of that. And the 83 election result would not have been as bad for Labour, and yeah, I don't think any of us would say that
87 might have been.
Yeah, I don't think any of us would say that Peter would have won in 83, even though he would have been the best person to be the leader of the party at that time. But then 87 may well have been very different, or if not 87, then certainly 92. And then that means that New Labour wouldn't have been created.
My goodness, that's a lot to compute.
Yeah.
The word patriot stands out. Labour somehow lost its reputation for, I mean, I'm thinking of Dennis Healy in his army uniform,
Yes.
a major at the Labour Party conference in 1945, the wartime role of people like Clement Attlee, or Mr. Benn for that matter, whose brother had died in the RAF, whose father was on the roof of Millbank firing at the German bombers in his 70s as part of the civil defence. Labour lost its patriotic way, didn't it?
Yeah, I think the Labour Party was instinctively a patriotic party for a long period of time. Clement Attlee as well. Hugh Gaitskell with his speech about the end of 1,000 years of history of Britain during the EEC. A fascinating passage in Tony Benn's diaries where the cabinet in the 70s were discussing the change of the passport, having become a member of the EEC, and says, I must renew my passport as quickly as possible while I can still get a blue passport. You know, instinctively patriotic across all sections of the party. For a long period of time, but that, as you said, I think quite rightly, I think that has gone.
Yes, and you know, a party which is not perceived by the people of a country to be for the country. Some of them can barely speak its name. I had a furious row on Twitter with someone the other day over using the term Great Britain, which is of course only a geographical term. But if you can't speak your own country's name, if you are perceived by a large number of your compatriots as somehow alien to them, you're not going to get very far. Peter Shore was a very British politician, wasn't he?
Very British, and I think you're right, that sense of patriotism has gone in the Labour Party, and it's ended up in a situation where there were sections of the Labour Party, certainly individuals within the Labour Party, who sneered at those who voted to leave in 2016, and were openly critical of them and you know, regarded them as stupid and ignorant.
Stupid
and so on.
or worse, racist.
Yes, racist, yeah. So I think that the consequence of that was the scale of the defeat last December, and if the party wants to come back, then it does need to try and rediscover those patriotic roots, which is one of the reasons why we wrote the Peter Shore biography now. As you said, it was very much forgotten. And then revived because of that speech at the Oxford Union. To think that a current Labour politician would make a speech anywhere near that scale is unthinkable, really.
Yeah, the content as well as the quality of it. Okay, you're now his vicar on earth, imagine, and you're looking at the three candidates for leadership of the Labour Party. With whom do you think Peter Shore would plump, and why?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, can I say I'm not anymore a member of the Labour Party. I left because of the way the Labour Party, at all levels, it seemed to me, was reacting to the Brexit result. So I left the Labour Party, joined the resurgent SDP, which is now back as a Eurosceptic political party. But people who still speak to in the Labour Party, or at least those who are still willing to speak to me, would pretty dismissive of the three candidates who are left, the ones who've been knocked out along the way. And then when I say to them, well, who is there on the back benches who would be a suitable person? Instead, most of them can't seem to think of anyone, really. So I'm not sure Peter would be too enthused about any of the candidates.
Wouldn't be enamoured of any of them?
No, I think of the three, Lisa Nandy is the most original of the three, certainly. But again, I don't think Peter would have been bowled over with any of the candidates at the moment.
I think he would have pressed Ian Lavery to stand, the current chairman of the Labour Party, a Eurosceptic, a man from the north, from a mining area. But of course, he's not in the contest. Did Peter Shore die bitter at the political circumstances that surrounded him and that he found himself in?
Well, all the people we spoke to would stress that he was not a bitter person by nature, really. And I only met him once, which was when I was doing my research for my doctorate just before he died. And what struck me at the time was how modest he was, and certainly that's come across in a lot of the interviews. So I don't think bitter is the right word. I think he'd be disappointed.
Disappointed, yeah. Well, it's not a disappointing read, I can assure everyone. Peter Shore and Dr. Kevin, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Sputnik. Well, alas, that means it's the end of the show, but you can still stay in touch with us through our social media portals. The most important thing, though, is that you come back next week at the same time, in the same place, and bring another viewer with you. It's been marvellous.